On paper, our life was flawless. Grayson Wallace, venture capitalist, keynote speaker, Forbes feature darling. Elena Wallace, community college literature professor with tenure and a quiet smile. We lived in a historic home with rosebushes that never dared bloom out of season, drove European cars with too many buttons, and hosted tasteful dinner parties with wine pairings printed on embossed cards. People said we were aspirational. I suppose we were, if your aspiration is to be invisible in your own marriage. It wasn't always bad. That's what makes it harder to explain. There were flowers, handwritten notes, lazy Sundays with takeout and foreign films. But those things faded like a painting left in the sun, gradually, subtly, until all that remained was the frame. The performance. Grayson never yelled. Never raised a hand or broke a plate. His weapon was charm dipped in acid, cutting remarks delivered with a smile so warm, guests didn't register the insult until 2 drinks later. He loved to talk about how smart I was in a way that made me feel stupid. My wife reads Victorian novels for fun, he'd say, raising his glass at fundraisers. She believes in honor, passion, and metaphors. Isn't that sweet? Laughter. Mine included. Because that's what I was trained to do. Smile. Absorb. Make myself smaller so his ego could stretch its legs. He never said, "You're not enough." He just built a world in which I couldn't possibly be. It was little things at first. The way he'd dismiss my opinion during dinner conversations. How he introduced me as the academic, like I was a novelty item from another century. The way he skimmed the syllabus I worked on for weeks and said, "Cute." Still doing the Shakespeare thing. There's a specific loneliness that comes from being talked over in your own home. And yet I played my part. I decorated our guest room with framed quotes from Virginia Woolf and hosted his colleagues' wives with cucumber sandwiches and gentle laughter. I perfected the art of the knowing smile, of listening intently, of looking just uninformed enough to be non-threatening. That's what he liked best, I think. That I never interrupted him. That I knew when to leave a room. That I wore heels at dinner so we looked balanced in photos. He saw me as supportive, elegant, uncomplicated. He saw me exactly how I needed him to. Because once I realized the role he'd cast me in, I stopped resisting it and started performing it with precision. Here's the thing about literature. It teaches you to pay attention. To catch the symbolism others miss. To study dialogue for what it doesn't say. I began reading Grayson the way I read a classic novel, examining the flaws in his character, tracking the inconsistencies in his plot. He thought I didn't understand what he did for a living. That financial analysis and asset restructuring were foreign languages to someone who wrote papers on narrative tension in 19th century fiction. What he failed to grasp is that reading people isn't that different from reading books. You just have to stay quiet long enough for the story to tell itself. He grew comfortable around me, unguarded. He stopped filtering his conversations, leaving spreadsheets open, taking calls on speakerphone. Elena doesn't care about this stuff, he'd tell his partners. She's all heart, no hustle. Wrong. I cared very much. I just stopped showing it. I started cataloging his business language. Words like reclassification, creative write-offs, offshore. I didn't confront him. I documented him. Not out of revenge, yet, but because some small voice in me refused to be gaslit into believing I was stupid. At first, it was a game. A secret between me and myself. Then it became something more. I remember the exact day it shifted. A Wednesday. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when he came in on the phone, pacing. "Just make it look like we paid for the development phase," he said. "No one's going to trace it if we loop it through Evermore first." Elena? She thinks Evermore is a Tolkien reference. I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because he had just given me the key to his kingdom. That night, I created a private folder on my computer called Class Notes. Inside, I pasted a transcription of everything he'd said. A few days later, I added screenshots, bank transfers, names, phone numbers. I wasn't entirely sure what I was building, only that I was building something. He once told a friend at a party, "The thing about Elena is, she's brilliant, just not in a practical way." They laughed. I sipped my wine and filed it away. I stopped thinking of myself as the main character in our marriage and started viewing myself as the narrator. Not powerless, just patient. Documenting. Waiting. Studying the arc. The rise and inevitable fall of a man who mistook quiet for clueless. And maybe I was complicit. For a while. Maybe I let the compliments and the curated life seduce me into submission. But then I remembered something I'd told my students once. Don't mistake a passive narrator for an inactive one. The most dangerous characters are the ones who watch everything. Grayson built a life on the assumption I would never ask the right questions. And I built a quiet rebellion on the knowledge that I already had. So yes, on the surface we looked perfect. The enviable couple with matching watches and photogenic brunches. But he never saw what was beneath the frame. And I had no intention of showing him. Not yet. People assume deception has a rhythm, something dramatic, like a piano chord struck in the middle of a quiet room. But when Grayson started leaving the truth in plain sight, it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like boredom. Or maybe overconfidence. Whichever it was, he stopped hiding things because he genuinely believed I couldn't understand them. And that belief became his favorite blind spot and my greatest advantage. It started with a phone call. I was slicing oranges for a salad in the kitchen when he walked in, Bluetooth headset already clipped to his ear. He winked at me and mouthed something about quick call before launching into a jargon-filled monologue I was clearly not meant to follow. No, listen, move the ever more assets through the Carter holding first. If we batch the invoices under consulting and timestamp it before Q3 ends, no one's asking questions. No. Elena? Don't worry about her. She's too busy debating Dickensian symbolism with freshmen. He laughed. So did I. But not for the same reason. Grayson thought I was slicing citrus and mentally alphabetizing the spice rack. In reality, I was cataloging. Ever more assets. Carter holding. Consulting invoices. It was all going into my notes later. And I wasn't debating Dickensian anything. I'd canceled office hours that afternoon to scrub through old bank statements he left open on the desktop monitor the night before. Grayson believed I didn't understand spreadsheets because I once asked him to explain line depreciation. What I was really doing was testing whether he'd dumb things down or dodge entirely. Spoiler, he dumbed things down. With gusto. I began to see a pattern. When Grayson believed he wasn't being observed or judged, his language became increasingly explicit. It was like watching someone take off layers of clothing without realizing the mirror was two-way. At first, I noted these moments for myself, maybe out of stubborn pride. Then I realized I was gathering something bigger than indignation. I was archiving proof. That's when the second phone came into play. Not because I thought he was tracking mine, though I wouldn't have put it past him, but because I wanted separation. Something pure. Clean. My own tool. It was a basic, gray burner phone. No fancy apps, just a camera and audio recorder. I named the first recording Eggshell Number 1 and labeled each subsequent file with something equally innocuous. Grayson loved the illusion of control. So I gave it to him, while quietly documenting every time he weaponized it. I started with audio. Muffled conversations through the office door. Late-night business calls taken in the backyard, thinking the wind would distort the content. My favorite was his Tuesday night whiskey-fueled tirades to his friend Jace about how to bury numbers under startup costs. That one became Eggshell Number 7. But audio wasn't enough. So I turned to paper. Not all the important stuff was encrypted or protected. Grayson was arrogant. He'd print quarterly reports, scrawl notes in the margins, then leave them on the console table like junk mail. I began photographing them one by one. At first, I felt a tremor in my hands each time. Then it became a ritual. Open phone. Flash off. 2 pictures. Email to myself with coded subject lines like chapter draft or plot structure template. There was one document that made me sit down on the floor after reading it. I was cleaning out a drawer in the office, under the guise of reorganizing it for spring efficiency, whatever that meant, and I found an unmarked folder tucked behind a stack of event brochures. Inside, a flowchart. Mariner Consulting was at the top, connected by arrows to no less than 5 other entities. Some had legitimate names: Bancroft Solutions, Winmere Ventures. Others were barely disguised, MC Advisors, named in such a way that even I could smell the fraud. Money moved in loops. Expenses were duplicated under different project codes. A donation to a charity called Harborlight was listed 3 separate times across 3 companies. That was the first time I said it out loud. "This is illegal," I whispered, sitting there on the hardwood floor with the sun pouring in through our bay window. And then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of course this was happening. Of course Grayson, with his Rolexes and rationalizations, thought no one would notice. Especially not the woman folding his socks and proofreading his LinkedIn posts. I emailed the flowchart to myself, deleted the sent file, then ran a cloth over the hardwood like I'd never been there. From then on, I developed a system. Each file, photo, or note was backed up 3 times. One copy went to a cloud drive with a boring, academic-sounding name, CHUCKLED_notes. Another went to a password-protected flash drive that I wore on a chain under my blouse. The third was stored on an old external hard drive I kept hidden inside the lining of a photo album labeled Alaska Trip '09, a trip we never actually took. I knew Grayson didn't remember half of what we'd done together. He certainly wouldn't remember a fictitious cruise to a place he never wanted to visit. He didn't notice when I started asking more questions, just enough to confirm things without appearing suspicious. "What's the difference between a deduction and a write-off again?" I asked one night, stirring pasta while he skimmed through emails. He smirked. "Still trying to figure that out, Professor?" I stirred clockwise and smiled. "Just writing a character who's married to a finance guy. Figured I'd make her more believable." That was the moment I learned something crucial. Men like Grayson love talking about themselves. Especially when they think they're teaching you something. He launched into a full explanation, complete with metaphors and mock quizzes. I nodded wide-eyed. I even took notes, fake ones, on a pad that later held my real summaries underneath. And all the while, he kept underestimating me. I started thinking of my life in acts like a play. In Act 1, I was the ingenue, earnest, trusting, eager to please. In Act 2, I was still smiling, but the audience had shifted. I wasn't performing for Grayson anymore. I was performing for myself. I was documenting everything, preparing for a scene he never saw coming. But not out of malice. Not yet. What people forget is that betrayal doesn't always detonate like a bomb. Sometimes it seeps into your bloodstream. Slow, silent. And by the time you realize how deep it's gone, you're already planning your survival. Grayson once said, half joking, fully smug, Elena couldn't find a paper trail if it was printed in sonnets. And maybe once, that would have been true. But now? I saw the paper trail in his pauses. In the way he phrased things. In the clients he mentioned, then later claimed he never met. I started reading his speech like I read literature, paying attention to the metaphors, the subtext, the unreliable narration. My favorite novel used to be Jane Eyre. Now it was Grayson Wallace, a cautionary tale written one false word at a time. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. That would be like revealing the twist in Chapter 4. No, I wanted the whole arc to unfold. I wanted him to feel safe. Confident. Like the world still revolved around his charm and cleverness. Because the more secure he felt, the more careless he became. And the more careless he became, the more prepared I was for the moment when everything, the emails, the lies, the fraud, the affair, would collapse right in front of him. But first, I needed more. I needed proof he'd never be able to dismiss with a chuckle or explain away with a confident pivot. I needed a finale worthy of the performance I was giving. And he just needed to keep talking. Because I was listening. Always. The moment I saw the name Camille Ross appear on Grayson's laptop screen, something in my body stilled. It wasn't rage. That came later. It wasn't even heartbreak. That had been happening in layers for months, maybe years. No, what I felt in that exact moment was confirmation. The way a detective must feel when they open a drawer and find exactly the thing they suspected would be there. Cold. Clean. Icy and precise. The preview line of the email said it all. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again when she's out of town. I didn't click right away. I didn't have to. I just stared at the open MacBook screen while the sound of the shower ran in the background. I could even see the steam drifting from under the master bathroom door, fogging up the edges of the mirror above the fireplace. Grayson was singing, off-key, confident, smug. That's when I did it. I moved with a kind of stillness, like I was being operated by muscle memory alone. I reached for my burner phone, opened the camera, and began to take photos. First of the email preview. Then of the full message once I opened it. Then the thread. Weeks of communication. A month. 2. Then 3. Camille Ross. My cousin's best friend since middle school. The woman who helped plan my bridal shower. Who brought a bottle of wine to every Thanksgiving. Who once joked, Grayson's got that movie star smirk, doesn't he? He should come with a warning label. I had left. We both had. And apparently, she'd read the label and still decided to take a sip. I kept scrolling, absorbing each text like poison I'd chosen to taste. My hands were trembling, but not violently. Not dramatically. Just enough that I had to pause to steady the camera for some of the screenshots. The messages were explicit. Jokes about my sensitive professor routine. Complaints about my book club. Praise for her adventurous spirit compared to my permanent bedtime story energy. The phrases burned, but not like fire. More like frostbite. Cold, numb, and spreading fast. She doesn't suspect a thing, he had written in one message, followed by a winking emoji. Too busy highlighting quotes about virtue in dusty old paperbacks. That one made me smile. Because he was wrong. I had suspected. Not necessarily Camille, but something. The later nights. The deflected questions. The sudden new gym membership. The little self-satisfied grins he wore like cologne. But more than that, I knew Grayson. I knew how he operated when he thought no one was watching. I had studied him longer than I'd studied any character in literature. And what I saw in those messages was not just infidelity. It was disdain. Arrogance. Confirmation that the man I married didn't just stop loving me, he'd never respected me to begin with. And that made everything crystal clear. The documenting I'd done so far, emails, conversations, expense records, it had been about protecting myself. Proving to myself that I wasn't imagining things. But this was different. Now it was personal. Now it was war. I returned his laptop to the exact position I'd found it in. Keyboard angled 15 degrees to the left. The charger draped loosely over the side of the coffee table. I tucked my burner phone back into the fake spine of the encyclopedia volume labeled European Politics, Volume 3, a book Grayson would never think to touch, and straightened the blanket on the couch. When he emerged from the shower, towels slung low and grin high, I handed him his coffee and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "You're in a good mood," he said. I slept well, I lied. He sipped. Vanilla almond today? Thought I'd switch it up. He took another drink and mumbled, "Love that you still know my favorites." I smiled and turned away, letting the coffee machine hiss and hum behind me like applause. That afternoon, I made a decision. No more passive recording. No more quiet archiving. I was going to build something real. Something undeniable. And the first step was finding someone who could help me do it legally. Enter Maya Lin. Maya and I had gone to grad school together. She studied pre-law while I was knee-deep in Bronte and Baldwin. We hadn't kept in close contact, just the occasional congrats on LinkedIn or heart reaction on Instagram stories. But I remembered her. Sharp as glass, unflinchingly direct, and always several moves ahead of everyone in the room. I messaged her the next day under the pretense of catching up. She suggested coffee at a quiet cafe near the river. When she arrived, Maya looked the same, but sharper, her blazer fitted, her eyes more watchful. She didn't ask if I had a manuscript or why I'd reached out. She just waited. So, I began, stirring my tea. I've been playing with a story idea. A novel. Her brows lifted slightly. Married woman. Husband's having an affair. But it's not just the affair, he's hiding things. Financially. She finds documents. Alters her behavior. Starts gathering evidence. I sipped slowly. Maya didn't blink. I guess my question is, what kind of legal risks would she face if she started recording him? You know, for realism. The corner of Maya's mouth twitched. Is she a stand-in for someone I know? I smiled. No. But if she were, hypothetically, what should she be careful about? Maya sat back. That depends on the state. One-party consent laws are your friend. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, which, spoiler, would be you, then it's legal in most places. What about email? Screenshots? Financial statements? Perfectly legal to collect if it's in a shared household and you're not hacking into anything. But depending on the nature of the evidence, it might not all be admissible in court, especially if it was altered or accessed deceptively. So she leaned forward slightly, should avoid anything that crosses the line into tampering. I nodded. Good to know. She watched me carefully. Elena. If this character needs help, she doesn't have to pretend it's research. She can just ask. I looked down at my cup. She's not ready yet. But she's getting there. Maya smiled. Well, if she ever is, tell her to call me. I did. 2 weeks later. By then, I'd collected 38 screenshots, 16 emails, for audio files, and a digital copy of what I suspected to be fraudulent tax documents. I didn't give them to Maya yet. I needed to know what mattered and what didn't. What could get me a fair divorce, and what might interest federal authorities. Maya didn't flinch when I laid it out. The shell companies. The fake donations. The offshore transfers. She whistled softly. Jesus, Elena. This isn't a marital dispute. This is a federal case. I felt no satisfaction in that moment. Only clarity. I don't want revenge, I said. I want protection. I want truth. And I want to make sure Camille doesn't get a scent of what he's hiding. Maya nodded. Then we need to do this by the book. No slip-ups. No dramatics. I laughed quietly. Dramatics were never really my thing. She paused. Actually, they might be. If you're careful with the timing. I looked up. What do you mean? You want him exposed, right? Not just legally, but personally. Professionally. Publicly. I said nothing. Maya leaned in. Then we wait. Let him dig deeper. Get cocky. And when he feels most untouchable. I finished the sentence for her. We pulled a rug out from under him. I walked home from that meeting more awake than I'd felt in years. Camille had betrayed me, yes. But in doing so, she had handed me the final puzzle piece. Proof that Grayson didn't just cheat on me. He discarded me. Disrespected me. And assumed I'd never notice because I was too busy reading Pride and Prejudice. But I was done being predictable. Camille Ross. He picked her because she was bold. Carefree. Disruptive. The kind of woman who told you exactly what she wanted and made you believe it was your idea. But he forgot something. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was writing the next chapter. And I had a plot twist he'd never see coming. There's a moment every woman who's been underestimated will eventually face. It doesn't arrive in thunder or flame. It arrives in silence, like an email pinging into your inbox that changes the trajectory of your life. Mine came disguised as a spreadsheet I wasn't meant to see, attached to an email I wasn't supposed to access, left open on Grayson's tablet while he was in the shower. It was labeled simply, Mariner Trust Revision Draft. I opened it, 6 line items. Terms like asset redirection, holding transfer, and a quiet little entry at the bottom. Beneficiary, Camille Ross, pending reassignment. He had put her name on something. Something significant. I didn't know exactly what the trust covered yet, but I knew what it meant. This wasn't just a fling or an impulsive betrayal. This was planned. Coordinated. He was moving pieces around a board, thinking I was too distracted counting syllables and sonnets to notice. That was the morning I stopped calling this survival. This was strategy now. I reached for my phone, not the burner, the real one, and typed the message I'd been avoiding for weeks. Hey, can we talk again? I need to know how far I can legally go. Maya responded in under 3 minutes. Meet me at the law library at 10. Don't bring anything traceable. We met in the basement level of the Jefferson Legal Archive, a building that smelled like dust, ambition, and coffee someone forgot to drink. Maya wore a gray turtleneck and no makeup. When I arrived, she didn't hug me, just nodded. I'm guessing this isn't about a novel anymore. I shook my head and slid a small manila envelope across the table. Inside, photocopies of the Mariner Trust doc, screenshots of the digital file, and a summary of everything I'd found in his investor notes folder. She flipped through it all in practiced silence, only pausing to read specific phrases out loud. Asset consolidation via offshore partners. Jesus. I sat back. It gets better. I've been recording conversations. Some are just sleazy, but others? They mentioned shifting charitable donations across multiple entities. Same dollar amounts. Same EINs. 3 different shells. Maya's face didn't change, but her voice dropped into that dangerous calm I'd only seen her use once before in grad school when she dismantled a tenured professor's entire journal article line by line during a seminar. Elena, she said, carefully, your husband is laundering money. And from what I can tell, he's not even very good at it. I didn't laugh. I need to protect myself. And I want to make sure when this blows up, I'm not dragged down with him. You won't be. But you have to follow my lead exactly. No late-night revenge posts. No burner phones left lying around. No one else gets looped in unless I approve them. I nodded. Understood. She tapped her fingers against the manila envelope. And we'll need more. A forensic accountant. I figured. I know someone discreet. Works under NDA. We'll say he's consulting on your book. That made me smile. Finally, the fictional novelist excuse pays off. Maya didn't smile back. Elena, this is serious. If any of this is traced back to you before we're ready, Grayson will spin the narrative. You'll be the paranoid wife. The sentimental fool who couldn't handle a real man's business. He'll ruin your reputation, not just legally, but socially. I took a breath. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of folders. We start with these. Divorce law primers, financial tracing basics, and whistleblower regulations. Read them. Highlight them. Annotate them the way you do with your novels. And Elena, yeah? Don't underestimate how many people will take his side until the very last moment. Especially women. That stopped me. Why? Because men like Grayson are charming. And because believing he's a fraud means admitting they were fooled too. Not everyone's ready to do that. She pushed the folders toward me. But you are. I didn't respond right away. I just pressed my palm against the top folder. The embossed lettering read fiduciary misconduct and civil recovery protocols. Dry. Dense. Terrifying. But suddenly, inviting. Like I'd been given the blueprint to a language I was always meant to speak. The next 2 weeks were a blur of strategy. Maya introduced me to Devin Hallett, a forensic accountant who wore hoodies and glasses and carried himself with the exact type of quiet certainty I craved in allies. He came to my office pretending to be a guest lecturer on interdisciplinary research ethics. While Grayson thought I was organizing a panel for visiting faculty, I was actually giving Devin full access to 5 years of financial documentation. He didn't react to much. Just read, clicked, and occasionally muttered things like amateur hour and did he really use the same IP address for 2 LLCs? But then, 3 days in, he called me at 7:42 a.m., a time I now associate forever with the beginning of the end. Elena, he said, do you remember signing a prenup? Of course, I replied. 3 days before the wedding. His family insisted. Maya has a scanned copy. Right. That's the one I got. But, well, there's another version. I froze. Another? Yeah. Same formatting. Same signature page. But different clauses. It's been tampered with, digitally edited after the signature scan. Very subtle. Someone embedded 2 new paragraphs into the middle of the document. But your signature is still intact at the bottom. My blood went cold. What do the new clauses say? One is about asset protection. The other limits spousal claim to any property acquired through Wallace Holdings or its subsidiaries, unless proven to be marital in nature. Translation: I would get nothing. Absolutely nothing. He had forged a legal document. Not sloppily. Not impulsively. Carefully. Quietly. With enough distance to deny, but enough precision to ruin me if I hadn't looked. Devin continued. It's fraud, and it invalidates the entire agreement. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the darkened computer screen. Grayson hadn't just cheated. He had been preparing to discard me. To keep me quiet. Broke. Powerless. But what he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask, was that I'd already anticipated this. I had evidence. I had backups. I had allies. And most importantly, I had time. Because the longer he kept believing I was the woman who baked muffins and couldn't pronounce amortization, the deeper he dug his own grave. Maya called that night. I want to float an idea, she said. You don't have to do it this way, but what if we waited for the perfect moment to reveal it all? I already knew what she meant. A trap. A public one. A moment of his choosing. So the humiliation would feel poetic. Like what? I asked. An anniversary dinner. A fundraiser. Somewhere he feels powerful. Where he'll make a speech. Where people will listen. My mind was already assembling the scene. Grayson in a navy suit, wine glass in hand, toasting to 5 years of partnership. My folder tucked beneath a white linen napkin. Camille in attendance. Our friends. Our families. Business partners. I exhaled. That sounds perfect. Then we keep building until then, Maya said. But Elena, this is dangerous. If he finds out too soon. He won't, I said. He doesn't see me. She paused. Good. Let's keep it that way. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, rereading old texts between Grayson and Camille. There was one that stood out. Can't wait to have you all to myself. She's too smart to be this oblivious. I laughed, an actual laugh. Because I wasn't oblivious. I was careful, and patient, and legally bulletproof. So when people ask me, later, how I pulled it off, how I managed to dismantle a man like Grayson Wallace with nothing more than tea, textbooks, and patience, I'll tell them this. You don't need to fight loud. You just need to learn the rules of their game. Then rewrite them. In your favor. There's a kind of violence in discovering you've been erased, quiet, legal, strategic erasure. Not a scream. Not a slap. Just a signature sitting on a page that doesn't say what you remember it saying. The day Devin confirmed the prenup had been altered, I sat perfectly still on the back porch, phone still in hand, as the wind played with the hem of my cardigan. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I just kept thinking. He did it while I was married to him. He forged my consent while I was still making him breakfast, still ironing his dress shirts, still listening to him drone about tax structures as if he were doing the world a favor. It was surgical. A quiet dismembering of my rights. Of everything we were supposed to share. I remember our original prenup vividly. Not because I'm sentimental, but because Grayson's family made it feel like a negotiation for a business merger. His father brought it up during brunch at the Marina Club. Nothing personal, he said over a mimosa, just standard protection for the Wallace estate. Standard protection. That was the language they used for me. Like I was a natural disaster waiting to happen. Something to be prepared for and locked out of the vault. I didn't argue. I was marrying Grayson, not his family's legal counsel. I read the document. I asked questions. I made sure the terms were fair, if not generous, at least balanced. And when I signed it, I felt like I was protecting both of us from what-ifs we'd never need. The version Devin found? It wasn't what I signed. 2 additional clauses, Clause 12 and Clause 13, tucked neatly into the fine print between the asset declaration and the intellectual property section. The formatting was seamless. The language was lawyer-speak perfection. Clause 12 redefined shared marital assets to exclude anything acquired under Wallace Holdings or its umbrella corporations unless explicitly co-owned. Clause 13 assigned Grayson sole discretion in determining what constituted active participation in marital asset growth. In plainer terms, I was entitled to nothing. Not the house. Not the investments. Not the retirement plan. Not even the vacation property I helped furnish. And the kicker? The date on the signature page hadn't changed. He had lifted my signature, digitally or otherwise, and affixed it to a new, surgically altered contract. A forgery. And I might never have known if I hadn't started digging. When I told Maya, she didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. Then, this is criminal. I nodded. I know. Did he do this himself? Or did someone help? I don't know. But the file metadata shows it was modified 6 months after we signed the original. Then there's a trail. And we're going to find it. The worst part wasn't the forgery itself. It was the realization that he had planned to betray me. Long before Camille. Long before I knew to suspect anything. This wasn't reactive. It was premeditated. He wanted insurance. A way to discard me cleanly when I outlived my usefulness. And like any good insurance policy, he hoped it would never be needed. That I'd remain blissfully unaware, clinking wine glasses at charity events, reading Austen by the fireplace while he slipped more of our life into someone else's name. That night, I did something that felt oddly sacred. I retrieved our wedding album from the hall closet, dusted it off, and sat cross-legged on the floor. Every photo looked like a crime scene in retrospect, every smile a red flag. Grayson holding my hand as we cut the cake. Grayson kissing my temple under a canopy of white roses. Grayson whispering something to his father while I laughed at a joke I now suspected had been at my expense. And beneath it all, the voice in my head. You married a man who planned your exit before you even arrived. I placed the album back in the closet. I didn't need the photos anymore. I had the real record, emails, contracts, evidence, a modified prenup. I was building something far more powerful than a scrapbook. The next day, Maya brought in her colleague, Elias Raymond, a document analyst who looked like he lived on black coffee and contempt for incompetence. He wore gloves to handle the paper copies I provided. His eyes lit up the moment he compared the two documents side by side. See this? He said, pointing to a seemingly harmless margin shift. It's subtle, but here, this isn't the same formatting software used in the original draft. The kerning is tighter. Paragraph spacing is off by 0.2 points. Someone replicated the style, but not perfectly. So it's a forgery? He grinned. Oh, it's beautifully illegal. Maya leaned forward. Could you testify to that? I could lecture on it, he replied. And I will. He handed me a short report, just 3 pages, but every line of it was a nail in Grayson's coffin. This isn't just a fraud, Maya said. It voids the prenup, which means the court reverts to standard division of marital assets. I raised an eyebrow. 50-50. She nodded. At least. If we can prove intent, and we will, it may tilt in your favor. I folded the report, placed it into my fireproof lockbox, and looked Maya straight in the eye. When we go public with this, I want it to be loud. Oh, it will be, she said. But until then, you keep playing the part. So I did. I made his favorite roast chicken. I complimented his cufflinks. I even pretended to forget to RSVP to our anniversary dinner until he reminded me with a smug little smile. Don't worry, he said, kissing my cheek. I've handled all the details. Just show up and look beautiful. I smiled back. That's what I do best. It wasn't just acting anymore. It was art. I studied his behavior the way a biographer studies a tyrant, meticulously, methodically. Every deflection. Every casual cruelty. Every moment he reveled in the fiction he believed was his alone. I watched him sign documents without reading them. I watched him laugh at Camille's texts while pretending he was replying to a work email. I watched him explain, at one dinner party, that Elena's real talent is patience. She could sit through anything. Even me. And I thought, yes. But not for the reason you think. What Grayson didn't know was that I had begun rewriting our story the moment he started editing the ending without me. The forged prenup wasn't a wall, it was a window. A view into the version of him he kept hidden behind charm and tailored suits. And through that window, I saw everything I needed. But still, I waited. Because timing matters. Because a knife makes a cleaner cut when it's slipped between arrogance and applause. Because it wasn't enough to expose him in court. I wanted the performance. I wanted the room. I wanted his downfall to echo in the ears of everyone who ever said, "Elena's lucky to have him." I wanted them to see exactly how lucky he was to have me until he threw it away. And then? I wanted to make sure he never recovered. Not through vengeance. Not through rage. Through facts. Through timing. Through precision. The kind you only learn from literature and betrayal. You know what's funny? After 5 years of marriage, Grayson never once suspected I was watching him more closely than anyone ever had. He assumed I'd settled into my role, a quiet wife in cardigans and ballet flats, poring over Austen and folding cashmere sweaters. He believed I was harmless. And that belief became the rope he used to tie his own noose. The moment Maya and I confirmed the prenup was forged, I could have gone straight to a divorce attorney. I could have confronted him, screamed, thrown a wine glass against a wall. But theatrics weren't my weapon. Patience was. And weaponized patience is a terrifying thing. I spent the next 6 months perfecting my performance as the unthreatening wife. I laughed at the same recycled jokes. I asked him how his meetings went with just enough curiosity to be cute, not suspicious. I even massaged his temples after stressful work calls, the same hands that would later hand his entire financial empire over to the authorities. Every morning, I brewed his coffee just the way he liked it. Dark roast, splash of oat milk, 1 cube of raw sugar, and every evening I cleaned up after his clutter, his arrogance, his missteps. But behind that routine was a system so precise it would have made an FBI agent blush. I had 3 external hard drives for cloud backups under fake account names, 2 physical safes, and 1 locked box hidden in the hollowed base of a globe he'd bought from a design catalog and never once spun. I categorized everything: emails, call logs, bank statements, voice memos, recorded conversations. Each file had a name, a tone, a purpose. Folder 1, Legal Insurance. Proof of the prenup forgery. Camille's messages. Grayson's own confessions recorded during post-dinner rants he assumed I wasn't listening to. Folder 2, Financial Fraud. Bank transfers to non-existent vendors. Duplicated donations. Creative deductions so creative they bordered on the surreal, like the time he expensed $9,700 for consultant services rendered by a company that turned out to be a registered shell in Barbados. Folder 3, Personal Character. The texts, the surveillance screenshots, the incident where he drunkenly joked at a dinner party that if I ever left him, she'd walk away with a bookshelf and a tote bag. That quote alone was worth its own PDF. At first, I felt guilty, like I was the one lying. But the guilt morphed into clarity. I wasn't betraying my husband. I was documenting the betrayal he'd spent years perfecting. There's a discipline in playing dumb. A power in letting someone monologue when you know you'll be the one holding the script in the end. And so I watched. Listened. Waited. I watched him flirt with Camille across the living room during a holiday party, using the same charm he once used on me. I watched him skim through charity gala invites, choosing which cause would look best in a press release. I watched him forget our anniversary, then cover it up with an expensive bracelet I later learned he'd bought in a 2-for-1 deal. Camille wore the other one in a photo she didn't realize I'd seen. And still, I smiled. Still, I baked. Still, I played the role. Every mask I wore had a purpose. The literature professor, mask, kept me underestimated. The housewife, mask, kept me invisible. But my favorite? The supportive spouse, mask. That one let me into every room, every document, every call. Grayson never once locked his office drawer. He never once asked why I was suddenly interested in filing receipts. He certainly never noticed that the woman who didn't understand numbers was quietly reading legal briefs after he fell asleep. I began annotating financial records like I annotated poetry, searching for patterns, anomalies, contradictions. And like poetry, Grayson's financial behavior had rhythm. A quarterly pulse of movement, manipulation, and misdirection. I started diagramming it on my classroom whiteboard after hours, using fictional company names as placeholders. If anyone walked in, I could wave it off as plot building for a character in my novel. Which, of course, was entirely true. Grayson's downfall was the most compelling story I'd ever written. And in that story, time was my greatest ally. I waited while he consolidated the Evermore account. I waited while he renamed assets under shell companies with names that sounded like Summer Homes and Yacht Clubs, Cliff-Died Holdings, Belden Consulting. I waited while he moved Camille into a penthouse condo under the guise of corporate hospitality, a place I'd later prove he visited 39 nights in 6 months, each with location data and timestamps. And then, finally, I waited for him to plan our anniversary dinner. It was his idea. Of course it was. 5 years, he said. A milestone. Worth celebrating. He wanted to book out the Magnolia Room at Seville's, a restaurant with chandeliers so delicate they were shipped from Venice and insured like priceless artwork. Just let me handle it, he said, patting my cheek like I was a Labrador. All you have to do is show up and look beautiful. I wanted to laugh. He said it like it was a gift. As if being paraded around in a designer dress for his associates' amusement was some grand romantic gesture. As if he hadn't been sleeping with Camille for the last year and altering legal documents before breakfast. I let him plan it all. The guest list. The menu. The flowers. He even ordered a cake with the words 5 years of excellence written in gold script. I nearly choked when I saw it. But I played my part. I even bought a new dress, navy silk, long-sleeved, modest but elegant. He'd once said it made me look like a faculty wife from a liberal arts college. Perfect, because that was exactly the woman he expected me to be. Meanwhile, I coordinated with Maya and Devin. They confirmed the final report was nearly complete. Maya had already drafted the divorce papers, and Devin had compiled a financial dossier that could double as evidence in a federal trial. Every detail was accounted for. The prenup forgery? Check. The money laundering? Check. The affair? Screenshot, printed, backed up, and queued to send in one click. All that remained was timing. We chose 9:15 p.m. for the reveal, right between dessert and the closing toast. Public enough to make him squirm. Late enough that the room would be full, wine flowing, masks slipping. We even rehearsed. I walked into the restaurant 2 nights before under the pretense of finalizing floral arrangements. What I was actually doing was locating the drawer next to my chair. It would hold the folder, the original prenup, the altered one, and a list of cross-reference timestamps between Grayson's bank transfers and his business trips. I traced the wood of the drawer with my fingertips. Steady. Silent. Certain. When I got home that night, Grayson was half-drunk on scotch and watching some documentary about entrepreneurs who rewrote the rules. He didn't notice the steel in my smile. He didn't see that I had already rewritten every rule in our marriage. He'd spent 5 years building a fortress around himself, stone by stone, lie by lie. And now? I knew every brick. Because I laid them with him. The long game requires sacrifice. It requires calm. It requires giving up the satisfaction of saying, "How dare you," in the moment, for the reward of watching someone realize you had no idea what I was capable of later. Grayson had no idea, because he never saw me as capable of anything. He thought I was all heart and literature, no teeth. But I was a woman who had quietly studied every move he made, documented every deviation, and built a case so solid even the IRS was beginning to circle. He wouldn't see it coming. He'd be too busy holding his wine glass, making his smug little speech about 5 years of success. And when the guests raised their glasses, I would raise mine too. To patience. To strategy. To the longest game I ever played and won. There's something intoxicating about planning a moment your enemy never sees coming. Especially when he believes you're still on his side, still walking 2 steps behind him, still wearing the dress he picked out and the smile he trained you to perfect. Grayson spent weeks orchestrating our 5th anniversary dinner like it was his own coronation. Private room at Seville's. 40 guests. Custom cocktails with names like Wallace Reserve. Monogrammed menus. He sent a mass email titled 5 years of partnership and vision. I stared at that subject line for a long time. It said everything about how he viewed our marriage. A brand. A pitch. A one-man show, with me playing the ornamental supporting actress who nodded and smiled while he recited lines to a crowd he thought was loyal. But not tonight. Tonight, the audience would belong to me. The day of the dinner, I woke early and brewed coffee. His, with oat milk and raw sugar. Mine, black. I sat across from him at the kitchen island, watched him scroll through emails, and asked him sweetly if he was excited for the evening. Of course, he said, barely looking up. Just don't be late. Everyone's expecting you to be dazzling. I smiled. Naturally. He kissed my forehead like I was a well-behaved intern and left for the office, humming as he grabbed his keys. He had no idea that before the night ended, he would no longer have an office. Or a reputation. I spent the afternoon preparing not just makeup and hair, but the final touches on everything Maya, Devin, and I had orchestrated for months. In my clutch, a thumb drive containing the entire dossier. A printed copy of the altered prenup with forensic annotations. 2 documents Maya wanted me to present myself, divorce papers and a civil forfeiture notice. My phone with the text blast ready to send to every guest in the room. At 6:30, I arrived at Seville's. The maitre d' greeted me like I was royalty. Mrs. Wallace, the magnolia room is prepped. Your husband spared no expense. Oh, he's very good at that, I said warmly. The room was dazzling. Chandelier light glimmered off silver accents. Place cards curved in perfect calligraphy, with Grayson and me at the center of the horseshoe-shaped table. My name sat next to his like a placeholder he assumed would never move. Guests trickled in at 7. Colleagues, family, social climbers who clung to Grayson's charisma like barnacles to a yacht. They greeted me with polite awe, like I was an extension of him, his polished other half. Camille arrived at 7:15 in a red silk dress she absolutely knew I had worn to our 2nd anniversary. She waved across the room as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't seen every message she sent about how predictable I am, and how easy it was to fool me. Predictable. Easy. Good. Let them think that. Let them settle into their wine, their Wagyu appetizers, their belief that Grayson Wallace was the golden boy whose wife didn't ask too many questions. Grayson made his grand entrance at 7:30, flanked by his business partners, laughing with the swagger of a man who thinks the world exists to orbit around him. He kissed my cheek and whispered, I arranged everything down to the desserts. Just sit there and enjoy. You always know what I like, I murmured. He took his seat and raised his glass. To the woman who makes my life easier. And quieter. The room chuckled. I didn't. Not yet. Dinner moved quickly. Conversation buzzed. Grayson grew more animated with each glass of wine, slapping backs, telling stories that barely mentioned me. By the time dessert arrived, the room was steeped in rich food, richer people, and the collective assumption that everything was exactly as it should be. Then his business partner, Mark, stood to toast. To 5 years of brilliance. Elena, you're the anchor. And Grayson? You're the engine. He raised his glass. Everyone followed suit. Grayson stood. I just want to say, I've made a lot of good investments in my life. But none better than marrying someone who never questions my direction. Who lets me steer the ship without trying to take the wheel. Elena, my compass. He grinned down at me. That was my cue. I stood, lifted my glass, and looked directly at him. I'd like to say something too. He sat back down, smug. I pulled the thumb drive from my clutch and set it on the table beside my untouched chocolate souffle. 5 years ago, I married a man I believed was building a future with me. Tonight, I want to thank him for showing me exactly who he is. The room fell silent. Grayson's smirk flickered. This, I said, sliding the folder across the table, is the prenup I signed 5 years ago. And this, I placed a second document beside it, is the one you submitted to your legal team. With 2 illegal clauses inserted after my signature. Grayson opened his mouth. Closed it. And this, I said, holding up my phone, is a message I'm about to send. It contains photos, recordings, and financial documents you never thought I'd find. I tapped send. Around the room, phones buzzed. Guests looked down. Read. Gasps. A fork clattered. Grayson reached for his phone. Too late. Camille's face drained of color as her texts flashed across screens. Explicit. Arrogant. Cruel. Grayson half stood. This is a misunderstanding. No, Grayson, I said, calmly. This is documentation. And this, I gestured toward the door, is Maya and her colleagues arriving with divorce papers and a full report for the IRS and SEC. Maya entered, heels clicking like punctuation marks. Grayson turned a shade I'd never seen on human skin. You brought lawyers to our anniversary? You brought your mistress to my marriage, I replied. Camille stood. You didn't tell me. Camille, I interrupted, you were never meant to be told. You were disposable. Like me. But I decided not to go quietly. Grayson lunged for the documents, but Maya slid them out of reach. You forged a legal document, Grayson. You laundered money through charitable fronts. You committed tax fraud. And you did it all while assuming the woman who read novels couldn't possibly understand the plot. The maitre d' hovered in the doorway, pale. Should I? No, Maya said smoothly. We're just finishing dessert. Grayson's father stood from the far end of the table, face grim. Is this true? Grayson didn't answer. Mark picked up the forged prenup, scanned it, then looked at the original. He edited this. She's telling the truth. One by one, the people he counted as allies began backing away. Camille bolted. Grayson looked around the room and saw, finally, that no one was smiling. He turned to me. You planned this. Yes, I said. I did. You used me. I tilted my head. No, Grayson. You used me. I simply paid attention. His voice dropped. You'll regret this. I smiled. I already did. For 5 years. But not anymore. Maya handed him the papers. You've been served. That was when Grayson made his final mistake. He reached for the papers, and in doing so, knocked over the cake. 5 years of excellence smeared across the tablecloth in a collapsing swirl of fondant and irony. No metaphor could have been more perfect. I looked at the mess, then at him. Ironic, isn't it? I said softly. You built an empire on controlling the narrative. But you forgot one thing. What? I write too. The hardest part about surviving a storm isn't the destruction, it's the silence that follows. When the noise fades, when the guests have gone home, when the restaurant manager has cleaned the last smear of cake from the tablecloth and the legal team has packed up their briefcases, what's left is just stillness. And in that stillness, you find out who you are. Grayson was arrested 3 days after the anniversary dinner. The federal agents hadn't wanted to make a scene in public, not yet. But between Maya's airtight packet and Devon's financial report, they had enough for a warrant. A quiet takedown. Early morning. His home office still smelling faintly of cedar and self-importance. They found encrypted drives. Cash. A burner phone of his own. Camille, predictably, disappeared. Her condo was vacated within a week, her social media wiped clean. A mutual friend told me she was last seen in Costa Rica. Or maybe Croatia. It didn't matter. She wasn't the story anymore. Grayson was. His face made the local news by Friday evening. A well-dressed mugshot as if he'd tried to smirk even then, still believing he could spin the story. Local investor charged with tax fraud, document forgery, and financial misconduct. My favorite headline came from a mid-tier business journal. The man who thought his wife wouldn't notice. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. The guests at the dinner? They'd been whispering for weeks. Some tried to apologize. Others kept their distance. And a few quietly thanked me. For all of us, one woman said at the grocery store, "You did what we dream of but don't dare." I nodded politely and continued walking. Because that's the thing about justice, it's not always loud. Sometimes, it's measured in the weight that finally lifts from your chest. In the silence that no longer feels suffocating. In the air that smells like freedom, not tension. The house? It was mine. Grayson had signed over his share 2 months before the dinner without realizing what he was doing. Maya had slipped the paperwork into a stack of routine refinancing forms. He didn't read it. Just signed where I told him to. beautiful and helpful, he'd said at the time. I had smiled. Now I walked through the halls alone, not as a woman abandoned, but as one who chose herself. I repainted the bedroom, donated the designer suits he left behind, replaced the art he had chosen to impress guests with prints that made me feel something, a Rothko in deep burgundy, a botanical sketch with ink blots that resembled a bleeding heart. The closet felt bigger now. Not because things were missing, but because I was no longer making myself small to fit next to them. My mornings changed. No more early wake-ups to brew coffee for a man who never once noticed I drank mine black. Now I lingered in bed, reading for pleasure again, not to decode a man, but to rediscover myself. I reread Jane Eyre. This time, not as a wife wondering if she was being gaslit, but as a woman who had locked her own attic door and walked away from the fire before it started. At the college, I returned from sabbatical with a quiet confidence that surprised even me. Dr. Elena Hart, yes, I reclaimed my maiden name, was no longer the woman who apologized when students talked over her or colleagues took credit for her committee work. I found my voice, not through volume, but through certainty. I also launched something new. What started as coffee chats with a few curious students became a weekly workshop, hidden in plain sight, financial literacy for women. The administration offered me a grant. Community groups asked if I could run versions for adult learners. Even high school teachers reached out. Funny how the professor who loved novels became the one teaching young women how to read tax returns and spot predatory financial behavior. I wore that irony like armor. And yes, there's a book coming. Maya introduced me to an editor who had followed the case. You could fictionalize it, she said, her eyes lit with opportunity. Tell it through story. But I didn't want to fictionalize anything. Women like me have had their stories turned into metaphors for too long. So I wrote it straight. The long game, how I turned the tables, took the evidence, and took my life back. It's not a memoir, exactly. More like a manual with soul. A guide for every woman who's ever been called sweet, soft, submissive, and decided to weaponize that underestimation instead. The publisher asked me what I wanted on the back cover. I gave them this. They said I was just the literature professor, just the quiet wife, just the woman who smiled at parties. But I was paying attention. And I was writing everything down. Grayson's trial is in 4 months. I'll testify. Calmly. Factually, without anger, but with precision. Because the goal was never revenge, it was truth. And I have all of it. His attorneys tried to negotiate. A private settlement. A plea deal that would minimize fallout. I declined. Because women like me are told to make things easier. Cleaner. Quieter. And I was done with quiet. I don't know where Grayson will be in 5 years. But I know where I'll be. Still teaching. Still writing. Still guiding women to see what's behind the curtain. I keep a copy of that forged prenup in my office. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. A woman who knows the value of her signature should also know the value of her silence and when to break it. Sometimes I catch students looking at me differently now. With awe, maybe even with fear. I don't mind it. Because for years, I was the woman in the background, the afterthought. Now I'm the warning. And the example. And the voice they remember when they're told to stay in their lane. Camille reached out once. A short email. I didn't know. I was lied to too. I didn't respond. Not because I hate her, but because I don't owe her closure. I wrote my own. And now? I'm building something better. Not a life designed to impress others. Not a performance for public consumption. Just a life that feels real. Safe. Unapologetically mine. The same students who once called me gentle now describe me as terrifying in the best way. One even said, "You taught me that being underestimated is a superpower." I smiled, because that's the truth. The real story behind the headlines, the courtroom drama, the viral dinner moment? It's this. I was never fragile. I was forged. And now? I'm unstoppable. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who sits in the front row of a courtroom, legs crossed, spine straight, watching the man she once shared a bed with scramble to explain his crimes to a jury. But here I was. 3 months after the anniversary dinner that set everything in motion, and Grayson Wallace, former venture capitalist, current defendant, was finally seated on the other side of justice. The courthouse was older than it looked from the outside. Inside, it smelled of paper, tension, and the kind of generic carpet cleaner that never quite manages to scrub out the history. The walls were beige. The air conditioning was always either too cold or not cold enough, and every single person in the room had an opinion, spoken or unspoken, about the case. Reporters showed up early. Not just because of the fraud, but because of the drama. The wife who outsmarted the empire. That was their favorite narrative. I'd seen the headlines. Wallace versus Wallace, a marriage unraveled by financial misconduct. Scorned or strategic. Elena Hart breaks her silence. From literature professor to IRS collaborator, the woman who brought down a millionaire. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the money. It was about truth. About showing people like Grayson that you don't get to weaponize charm and legal jargon and believe the world will just roll over for you. He looked tired. Smaller somehow. Still well-dressed, of course. His lawyers had made sure of that. But there was a shakiness in the way he held his pen. A desperation in the way his eyes scanned the room for familiar faces that weren't there. Camille? Gone. She didn't even respond to the subpoena. No one could find her. His business partners? They'd all flipped. Some faster than others. One even entered a plea deal to avoid full exposure, which made the prosecution's job easier. The rest just quietly disappeared from the public eye. The defense tried to paint Grayson as a misunderstood genius. Aggressive business practices, yes, his attorney said, but not criminal. And certainly not malicious. They blamed the forged prenup on a clerical error. A drafting mistake. As if clauses simply materialize themselves into legal documents in the dead of night. When it was my turn to testify, the room hushed. Maya squeezed my hand before I stood. I took the oath. My voice didn't shake. They asked how I found the documents. How long I'd been collecting evidence. What I knew. What I saw. What I heard. And I answered everything. Calmly. Honestly. Without dramatics. Just facts. I recorded conversations, I said. With his knowledge, according to the one-party consent laws in this state, you pretended not to understand, the defense attorney accused. I observed, I corrected. There's a difference. You gathered this information over 5 years? I paid attention over 5 years, I said. The gathering happened once I realized what he was hiding. The jury watched me like I was a character in a novel they couldn't quite pin down. Some with admiration. Some with discomfort. All with attention. I pulled out the physical copy of the prenup, the altered one, and then the original. Placed them side by side. Devon had already testified to the digital manipulation. The metadata. The formatting inconsistencies. I added the context. I signed the original 3 days before the wedding, I said. Grayson watched me read every line. The version submitted during our separation includes clauses I never saw and would never have agreed to. Why didn't you confront him sooner? Because if I had, I wouldn't be believed. Because if I had, he would have destroyed the evidence. Because I needed to build something solid. Not emotional. Not speculative. Legal. Admissible. There was a moment, just one, when Grayson looked at me and I saw something like recognition in his eyes. Like maybe, finally, he realized I wasn't the woman he thought I was. That I'd never been. They tried to rattle me. Tried to imply I was vindictive. That I orchestrated this for my own gain. Did you benefit financially from your husband's downfall? They asked. I looked directly at the attorney. I'm not the one who created shell companies. I'm not the one who laundered donations meant for children's hospitals. I'm not the one who forged a legal document to strip a spouse of protection. I simply revealed what was already true. Silence. The prosecutor let it land before moving on. Later that afternoon, they played one of the recordings I'd provided. Grayson's voice filled the courtroom. Casual. Confident. Boasting. She doesn't even know what a 1031 exchange is. I told her we were donating to literacy programs, and she clapped. As long as I smile and give her a bracelet every Christmas, she stays out of it. The jury winced. One woman scribbled something on her notepad without looking up. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. Because that version of me, the woman who clapped and smiled and accepted the bracelet, was gone. The defense didn't call Grayson to the stand. They said it was a strategic decision. But the truth? He couldn't risk it. He couldn't sit there, under oath, and explain how his offshore accounts ended up with Camille's name on them. He couldn't look 12 strangers in the eye and say he didn't know the prenup had been altered. He had nothing left to spin. When the closing arguments ended, the room emptied out like a balloon losing air. Slowly, with a kind of subdued anticipation. We waited. 1 day. Then 2. On the 3rd day, the jury returned. Guilty. On all counts. Wire fraud. Tax evasion. Document forgery. Malicious financial manipulation. Grayson didn't speak. He just lowered his head as the verdict was read. The sentencing hearing is in 60 days. He could get 10 years. Maybe more, depending on how generous the judge feels. I'll be there. Not because I want to see him suffer, but because I want to be seen. Because women who look like me, quiet, bookish, smiling too politely at dinner parties, are too often erased from the narrative. Not this time. After the verdict, I stepped outside and looked up at the gray sky. Rain was coming. The kind that always arrived in spring, gentle but persistent. The courthouse steps were slick, the reporters careful with their footing. One of them called out to me, "Do you have anything to say?" I thought about it. Then said, simply, "Sometimes the quietest woman in the room is the one documenting everything." I walked away. No fanfare. No entourage. Just the knowledge that I had spoken the truth. In my way. In my time. And that I'd never be underestimated again. I used to think legacy was something etched into marble. A plaque on a bench, a name on a donation wing. Something permanent and cold. But I've come to learn that legacy is actually much quieter and far more alive. It's in the ripple effects. The things you choose to teach. The stories you dare to tell. The truths you refuse to leave buried, even when they make people uncomfortable. My story was never about destroying Grayson. It was about finding myself. And making sure no one like him could ever erase someone like me again. 2 months after the trial, the sentencing hearing was short and sharp. The judge called Grayson's behavior calculated, predatory, and egregiously arrogant. He sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 9. I sat in the gallery, not to gloat, not to revel in his punishment, but to close the book. Grayson didn't look at me. Not once. He left the courtroom in cuffs, escorted by 2 marshals who didn't care who he used to be. And I didn't care either. That version of him, the man who had whispered that I was lucky to be loved by someone so brilliant, who joked that my degrees were better suited for bedtime stories, was finally gone. Stripped of power, of platform, of pretense. I walked out into the afternoon sun and didn't look back. Because my life wasn't waiting behind me. It was ahead. And it was already blooming. It started with a letter. A former student of mine, Danica, sent it through the department mailbox. Handwritten, folded 3 times. Dr. Hart. I watched your story unfold on the news. I always thought you were just the quiet professor with vintage skirts and worn paperbacks. I never realized you were a storm. Thank you. You made me believe I could leave my own Grayson. I did. I'm safe now. And studying accounting. With love. Danica. I cried for a long time after that. Not because it hurt, but because it healed something I didn't know was still cracked open. I kept that letter on my desk. It became a compass. If she could find the courage because I told the truth, then there had to be more women like her, waiting for someone to say, "You're not imagining it. And you're not alone." So I built something. With Maya's help and a local nonprofit support, I launched a small foundation called the Athena Ledger, a financial literacy initiative designed to teach women exactly what I wish I'd known 10 years earlier. How to read a contract. How to detect red flags in joint accounts. How to spot coercion dressed up as love. It began with weekend workshops in my classroom, folding chairs, whiteboards, the smell of stale coffee, and empowerment. 20 women at first. Then 40. then a waiting list. Single moms, divorced professionals, college students, grandmothers. One woman came with her teenage daughter and sat through every session with her hand on the girl's knee. "I want her to know what I didn't," she said. I knew exactly what she meant. Soon, local organizations took notice. We received a small grant from the state, enough to expand. We brought in speakers, accountants, attorneys, survivors. Women who turned their pain into expertise, and who refused to let it end with them. I taught a class called Financial Red Flags in Romantic Relationships. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about pattern recognition. When someone controls your access to money, I'd say, pacing with a marker in hand, they are trying to control your choices, your future, your voice. They listened. They took notes. Some cried, but every single one of them left with tools. Not just warnings, but plans. I watched women open their first solo checking accounts, build emergency funds, review insurance policies they'd never thought to question. One woman, a retired nurse named Carla, called me weeks later. "You saved my retirement," she said. "My boyfriend was slowly moving money into an account I didn't even know existed. You taught me how to trace it." I left him. It wasn't dramatic. It was dignified, calculated, precise, just like what I had done. Only now, I wasn't doing it alone. I was multiplying it. The book came out 6 months after the trial. Hidden in Plain Sight, A Woman's Guide to Financial Self-Defense. It wasn't a memoir in the traditional sense. I didn't recount every moment of pain. I didn't turn my trauma into spectacle. Instead, I used it as framework. Each chapter had 3 parts. A narrative moment from my experience. A breakdown of the financial/legal lesson inside it. Actionable tools for readers to use in their own lives. It sold modestly at first. Then a podcast picked it up. Then a TikTok creator read a passage aloud in one of her books that changed me videos. Suddenly, women were tagging me in posts. Page 113 made me close my laptop and go open a bank account. I read this and finally understood that "just sign here" is a red flag. My mom handed this to me and said, "Don't be me." We got a second printing within 3 months. My publisher called me with excitement in her voice. "Elena, you're starting a movement." But that wasn't quite right. I hadn't started anything. I had just named it. Women had been surviving quietly for centuries. They'd been paying attention, swallowing red flags, adapting, enduring. I had simply dared to stop enduring and then documented how. That documentation became instruction. That instruction became legacy. And now? Now it lives in classrooms and libraries and women's shelters and law firm waiting rooms. It lives in whispered conversations between sisters, daughters, best friends over coffee. It lives in me. My office at the college looks different now. The walls are the same soft gray. The bookshelves still house Austen, Baldwin, Morrison. But now they also house binders labeled financial abuse research, curriculum planning, and policy reform ideas. I sit at my desk and teach narrative structure and social power. Students don't just ask about literature anymore. They ask about law, about strategy, about resilience. And I tell them the truth. I didn't win because I yelled louder. I won because I studied the system. I used what I had. I waited, and then I wrote my own ending. Because that's what legacy really is. Not just surviving your past, but reshaping the future. Not just for yourself, but for the women watching. Women like Danica, like Carla, like Maya, who once told me, "Elena, you're the quietest hurricane I've ever met." She wasn't wrong. But I don't tear things down anymore. I build. One evening, after a lecture, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous, holding a well-worn copy of my book. "Professor Hart?" "Elena's fine," I said, smiling. She swallowed. "I just wanted to say, you changed my life. I left my fiancé after reading your story. I didn't even realize how much he was controlling until I saw it written down. You made me feel seen." I took the book from her, signed the inside cover. "To Olivia, for seeing yourself before it was too late." She left with tears in her eyes. And I stayed in my office a while longer. just breathing, just existing. Without fear, without secrecy, without anyone's permission. That's legacy too. Not just what you build, but who you become when you no longer have to play small. When you know, deep in your bones, that survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the start of authorship. And I am the author now. Of my story, of my finances, of my name, of every woman who reads what I've written and decides, finally, to write something of her own.